As a fan of shoot 'em ups, I play a wide variety of games in the genre, whether it be classic shmups or more modern bullet hell games. One thing I've noticed in recent times is a bit of a divide between fans of older shmups and bullet hell games made by companies like Cave and Rising, as well as the Toho games. If you ask me, both styles of shmups have their various pros and cons. You can have fantastic games in either style, and some shmups may have elements of both. However, the one criticism against some older shmups that seems to come up more often than not is something known as Gradius Syndrome. So what is Gradius Syndrome? Gradius Syndrome means that when you die, you lose all of your power-ups and other items acquired prior to dying, and you have a very difficult time recovering when you respawn. This is named after the Gradius series, where players experience this all of the time in those games, especially in the earlier entries in the franchise. One death can make it clear almost impossible to achieve depending on where you die. All of the older Gradius games have checkpoints, meaning that you can't just die and use the invulnerability frames upon respawn to skip through a hard section. Now, Gradius is not the only series known for having Gradius Syndrome. The R-Type games are known for having a similar effect upon dying and going back to a checkpoint. Some shmup players nowadays will look at games like that and say, well, that's not fair, that doesn't sound fun at all. And I think for casual players who just want to make a little bit of progress, even if they're not going for a 1cc, that's a fair point. Games like this are almost never beginner friendly. However, as a hardcore shmup player, Gradius Syndrome is not a game killer at all. It's definitely an obstacle, but if you're playing for a 1cc, that alone probably won't stop you from getting it. In fact, I think players should always look at Gradius Syndrome within the context of a particular game. So let's talk about the earlier Gradius games for instance, as I've beaten the first loop of both Gradius 1 and Gradius 2 without continues or dying until the second loop. The biggest skill these games test is your ability to route the stages consistently and effectively. You need to know where you're going to position yourself on the screen and which enemies you need to kill first. You need to manage which power-ups you are going to use, especially with the unique Gradius power-up system. How many speed-ups are you going to take? Those speed-ups affect both your ship speed and the spread of your options. How soon do you go for those options? How many do you take? In Gradius 2, you have to worry about the option hunter if you have 4 options. Do you want the laser or do you want the double shot? Some players switch between them in Gradius 1 for certain stages. In Gradius 2, the ripple laser is a very popular choice all around. Unlike in your typical Cave or Toho game, you're not going to be threading the needle by micro-dodging intricate patterns. You're going to be macro-dodging instead of micro-dodging most of the time because you have a fairly big hitbox compared to, let's say, Dodonpachi Resurrection or Mushihime Sama. You're going around things, typically not through them. However, it is important to note that in the case of Gradius, those games are known for having a smaller hitbox than a lot of other shmups from that time period. Plus, even though you power down completely when you die in these games, you are extremely powerful while you are fully powered up. Your laser in the original Gradius game, for example, is awesome, as its hitbox is larger than it seems, and when you have all 4 options and 2 or 3 speed ups, you can cover most of the screen pretty easily. Your options can be positioned to help protect you from certain types of projectiles like the ones from the infamous boa heads. They can also fire missiles. Then on top of all that, you have either a shield, or if it's Gradius 2 for example, the force field, that you can grab that allows you to take many hits potentially before dying. So the game is no longer one hit kill. That's not even getting into safe spots that are viable in these games for certain bosses. While deaths, when fully powered up, are very painful, the reality is that these deaths are almost always the result of some simple mistakes that are preventable. In the moment, these games are not asking you to do crazy dodges. You just need to execute with the resources you are given. Gradius 1 overall, for example, is not considered a very difficult clear, in the first loop at least, because of how powerful you are when fully powered up and the fact that each loop is pretty short, around 15 minutes. Gradius 2's first loop isn't that much harder either, though the loop is definitely longer. Also, Gradius 2 is a fantastic game overall, despite the Gradius Syndrome, because it has a ton of variety to the level design and has a unique boss fight for each stage. It gives you multiple ship setups that have different weapons and missiles, and the ships play differently. It also established the speed stage and boss rush. These are tropes that would continue into later Gradius games like 3 and 4. I highly recommend that game overall. Now, can Gradius Syndrome be a serious problem? Yes, but typically this is in the case of games that have other issues beyond that. So the arcade version of Gradius 3 is a great example of this, as that game is just too hard whether there are checkpoints or not. Even if you didn't lose all of your power-ups upon dying in that game, it would still be tough, especially because of things like the Ice Cube section. And on top of that, you don't get continues. Gradius Syndrome, on top of all of this, just makes the game almost impossible for even a lot of hardcore players. Plus, even if you go back to Gradius games before that, the checkpoints even in Gradius 1 and 2 aren't always well placed. There's an awful one in Gradius 2 in the second half of Stage 3 during the crazy floating crystal section with the RNG and the fact that these crystals cover almost the entire screen. And usually in the later stages of each loop, recovery gets much harder outside of maybe the very beginning of a stage. Sometimes it is the Gradius Syndrome and too many things coming at you without a lot of iframes, and sometimes it's just terrible respawning spots. Like if you die in the middle of this speed stage in Gradius 2, for example. What happens there is you get placed next to multiple turrets that are ready to shoot you down. Also, speaking of a game that's not Gradius and still has this problem without checkpoints, the early Raiden games. Great example of this. They don't give you much room to recover upon death because of the smaller popcorn enemies that constantly come on screen to attack you, especially in the later stages in the game. Even if you get a fairy early that gives you a max power-up upon dying, good luck trying to grab those power-ups because your bomb does not give you iframes and your ship movement is kinda slow while the enemies coming down to kill you are very fast. Plus your respawn iframes are not very long either, at least not long enough to make recovery more feasible. So to wrap things up, while Gradius Syndrome might not be ideal, it's certainly not the end of the world if there are other positive things going for a particular game. Context matters, in other words. That being said, if you don't like shmups or other games with this kind of level design, that's fine, as there are plenty of other games out there that don't do this, and maybe they test different skill sets instead. And now I want to know what you think of Gradius Syndrome and the games that have it. Let me know in the comments below. Also, if you enjoyed this video, hit the like button and subscribe for more videos like this, as well as playthroughs of classic games and even more modern shmups done with no continues or cheats. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you again soon.